Good morning and welcome to this webinar on ethical communication. We're very happy to see you here today and to present to you a true Nordic panel in the context of this new NORA lecture. Before I go into introducing the panelists, I will give the word to Dr. Alexander Boeman, who will tell you a little bit about the Nordic Alliance before we start.
Yeah, so also warm welcome from my end to everybody who tuned in this morning for this important topic. I'm Alexander Boeman. I'm an associate professor at BI Norwegian Business School for corporate communications and also the director of the Nordic Alliance for Communication and Management. Just a few words before we start about the Nordic Alliance, or NORA for short. So we are an interdisciplinary research group just founded this year who focuses on the value contribution of communications to organizations. And to this aim, specifically, we discuss and identify emerging trends and topics from mostly sort of a board level strategic and managerial perspective. And we do so in a Nordic setting and with particular interest in Nordic perspectives. So I'm very glad that we have such a truly Nordic panel for this session today, spanning from Finland over Sweden to Norway. And what we do also, or what we focus on, is bringing together executives, high-level corporate executives who are in charge of managing the intricacies of the communication function for their organization, bringing them together with researchers, not just from communications, but from other related management disciplines like innovation research, HR, and so on. And our work is supported by a small, unique group of research-minded executives who allow us to run joint workshops with them for mutual discovery, but also these more public events like these webinars and conferences that we can use to reach out to a greater community and try to really shape a little bit the discussion around these topics in the Nordics. So without further ado, I'm very glad and look forward to listening in to the important discussion on ethics today. So over to you. I'm just going to...
Thank you. All right, so our main topic that we have for you today is Communicators' ethical blindness. And we have actually found in the past couple of weeks that ethics is really a hot topic in this moment. We're very happy to have with us Professor Jesper Falkheimer. He's a professor in strategic communication in Sweden. And then we have Theresa Manes, who's the director of the Norwegian Communication Association. Welcome. Henrik Riedenveld, I hope I pronounced that right, the part of the Council of Ethics of Communication and the Council for Mass Media, also a philosopher at the University of Helsinki. And then myself, I'm a lecturer in communication of leadership and ethics here at BI. So we have kind of a diverse program for you today, discussing the results of the European Communication Report, reactions from practice, Finnish perspective, and then a communication scientific perspective on ethics. We're really interested in hearing from you as well, so you can use the Q&A function if you have any kind of questions. We will address those in the end, but please, during any of the presentations, just type in the Q&A and we will keep track of that. All right, so as a start, I will be handing over to Jesper Falkheimer, who will tell us a little bit about the European Communication Monitor results. Jesper, can you give a short introduction and then you can start.
Sure, thank you very much. Hello everyone, it's really nice to take part in this webinar, a true Nordic one. The only country we lack here is probably Denmark, but we're included in this survey that I will discuss a little bit. The European Communication Monitor has been done for 14 years. It's a European survey focused on communication professionals. And it's a pretty good survey when it comes to gaining insights into what professionals think about different aspects of communication. It's also done in other parts of the world, but European Communication Monitor was the first one that was launched several years ago. The empirical data consists of survey answers from around 2,400 practitioners in 44 countries. And this year, 2020, the report is focused on different aspects of communication, but ethical challenges is one of the main topics. And one may, of course, wonder why ethical issues is specifically interesting right now, but there are several reasons for this. It is a fact that the evolution of new media technologies, the increased complexity in the world and society, the increase of disinformation, propaganda, the negative aspects of strategic communication has created a lot of new discussions and challenges when it comes to ethical considerations among professionals. So I'm going into the results, part of the results, and I will present this right now. When it comes to the perception of ethical challenges, as you can see on this slide, it's a fact that at least 6 out of 10 professionals in Europe at large think that they have a lot of ethical challenges on a day-to-day basis, which means that if you look back, this has increased, obviously due to all these changes in society around us and the new technology and so on. We can change slide to the next one, please. There are differences in different parts of Europe. If we look at the numbers here, we can see that the highest portion of practitioners without any ethical issues are found in our countries, actually, the Nordic countries. While like countries such as Croatia, Portugal, Poland, and so forth have a higher level of ethical challenges according to the professionals. And one may, of course, question why. We can discuss that a little later. There is also a little bit of difference between the different countries here, where you could say that the Danish professional seems to not see as many ethical challenges as the other countries. Now we can change again to the next slide, please. When we look at the professionals, and we're going to discuss this more later, you can always think about how do you relate to ethical conduct. And obviously, many organizations have ethical codes, ethical guidelines, and so on in different aspects. And also professional associations, such as the Norwegian Communication Association, which is represented here today, have developed different ethical codes of practice. We also have international, more global codes of conduct. And the question is, of course, as a professional, how do you relate to these different platforms? And the survey shows that there are some differences here from a European perspective, but it's probably clear that the personal values and beliefs are number one for most professionals. That's very clear also in the Nordic countries. But what is a little bit different here, maybe from some other countries, is that the ethical guidelines of organization also seems to have a lot of importance. And then the least important seems to be related towards the ethical codes of practice from professional associations. And as you can see here, this is a little bit different. Denmark stands out a little bit. There's a higher reliance on organizational ethical guidelines than in the other Nordic or Scandinavian countries, sorry. This is, of course, something we can discuss, especially from a professional association perspective, maybe how do we develop codes of conduct that are actually having an impact on practice, that are valued for the professionals. Thanks. And the next slide comes into another question, which is related to how do professionals learn about ethics and how do they prepare for making good ethical decisions and so on. And we don't have to go into all the details here in these diagrams, but one thing that is evident is that most practitioners don't really have any training. They don't focus very much on ethical discussions or reflections as far as we can see according to this survey. There are differences between different organizations. Joint stock companies seem to have a higher level of focus on these issues than other types of organizations. We can also see that what is typical is maybe that you get a communication ethics class during your study program at the university or so on, but it doesn't seem to be very often that you get ethical training in your own organization, which is kind of interesting. We can go to the next and final slide in my presentation. Focusing on the managers and the directors and so on, you might think that they have more ethical training than other actors in the organizations, especially since they are supposed to make the most ethical decisions, of course. And the fact is that that's not a big difference between co-workers and managers, according to the survey. It's rather much alike. So altogether, to summarize this, you could say that most communication professionals don't really seem to have any ethical training. They relate more to organizational and personal values than professional associations, codes of conduct. And most communication professionals think that they have more ethical challenges today than ever before. And now, thank you very much, and over to you, Suzanne.
Thank you, Jesper. Very interesting. Thank you for the discussion. And I think this is it's a very timely topic, because in our conversation, Teresa, you said that you had just been working on the formulation of the codes of conduct. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that and kind of react to these findings in general.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Jesper. It was interesting to look at the results. And I'm not surprised that people in the Nordic countries or practitioners in the Nordic countries report that they have less ethical challenges. Not because I actually do think they do have less. I think most communicators meet ethical challenges daily, or at least weekly, but they might not think of them as ethical challenges. But they might handle them in the same way anyhow, because in the Nordic we're known as a trustful society, a society that levels trust highly, and also transparency is valued as an important very important for organizations to actually have succeed in the society. So for communicators working for transparency, I think it's very highly regarded value in the Nordic countries, and that's also why they might not perceive all these ethical challenges they face daily on when to how much information to go out with, when to release the information, what can media training do to the conversation in the public. All those things are also ethical challenges, but we just think of them as a part of our work. So when we looked at the ethical codes or the code of, we don't have a code of ethics, we have ethical principles that we think that our members should relate to and follow. We wanted to make them more easier, understandable, and updated to today's what we meet in work life today, and make them shorter and more concrete, so people actually can relate to them. So they were new less than a year ago, and we cut it down to quite a few principles regarding around being part of the public discussion, how to work against disinformation, but doing a contribution in the other way to actually enlighten the public conversation, work for more transparency, but also to include responsibility to data and how we use data and methods, because this is very important part of communicators' lives, work life today, and maybe not that high on the agenda that we have an ethical responsible there as well.
All right. Thank you so much. That is it's very interesting to hear, and I think it's very, very true. Like from experience, I find that ethical trainings overall are also often like on the bottom of the agenda, and a little bit unpopular, right? People don't like to be told to go to ethics training, but it's.
Yeah, and they might not think they need it, that they have these personal values, as we also saw in the study, that they guard their personal values that they actually grown with their whole lives, and that's part of the cultural society we live in as enough to make these decisions. But to discuss this internally in an organization and use the codes of ethics that are made by organizations and associations by us, but also by organizations, because they have lots of laws they have to follow as well. So the code of ethics for communicators should be on top of that, on how to make the decisions in ethical dilemmas regarding communication work. So that this should be a part of the daily discussion in the internal departments in the organizations, and not something you put up once a year or every second year, or if there's a crisis, then what should we do now? So it should be part of everyday work conversations as well. So we had a large process internally in the association when we changed the code of ethics, and all our local chapters were involved as well. And we had a course this spring in ethics and disinformation. But of course, to help people make these discussions and have these conversations, we want to develop a kind of package of ethical dilemmas that could be a start point for these discussions for our members.
All right. Yeah, thank you. I think that is also a very nice transition to Henrik. You have just had in Finland this very interesting conference on ethics in communication. So I will hand over to you and to hear all about that and the Finnish perspective.
Thank you, Susan. I'm going to try and hijack everybody's screen here. Just a second. As Susan mentioned, my background is in philosophy, and I worked within philosophy and media and communication studies as a researcher here, mostly here at University of Helsinki, for many, many years. And back in 2015, I was invited to be part of the first then being founded Council for Ethics of Communication in Finland. This is a joint venture. Let me just really briefly present to you the main outline here. It's a bit different from the Norwegian system because it's a joint venture of leading organizations of communication professionals in the country. Procom, which is close to your association in Norway, but also a trade union of communication professionals, Viesti. These two founded it, and quickly MTL, which is the association for consultancies and businesses working in PR and communications, and joined in, and also YAT, which is the trade union for the communication professionals in the public sector. Altogether, these associations have some 5,000-6,000 members. There's a bit of an overlap, so we don't quite know exactly how many people this cover, but I mean, it is really strong. So it is just about everybody in the industry working professionally in the country is member of at least one of these, and via that membership they also belong to this sort of self-regulation that we developed in 2015. So what we started with was developing a communication code of ethics, and then our first full term was in 2016-17, and I was the vice chair for the council, very much involved in developing that code. And then in 18-19, I was the chair of the council. We decided on term limits, 2 consecutive terms only, quite early on, so it wouldn't be just the same people in the council all the time. So my term limit is now over, and I was elected member of the Council for Mass Media in Finland beginning this year, which is the much older council for the self-regulation of journalism, founded already in 1968. So, well, Finland has a strong tradition of this type of self-regulation, and its coverage is fast. So, for example, the Council for Mass Media covers just about all journalistic media in the country. So, but what the Council in Finland, for communication, ethics of communication does is it produces the code, it produces opinions, like broader opinions concerning general practice of communication, and then comments on public discussions or particular cases of communication that have been, either in the public discussion or somebody has, brought it to the attention of the council. There's no formal reprimand system, at least for the time being, in place. Rather, the council tries to address matters on a more general, sort of slightly more abstract level, like this is not a good policy or this is not a good practice, and issue recommendations that would help the whole industry to develop ethically sound practices. So I'm just going to give you a really, really brief overview of the code. I mean, I'm not going to go into any details. The code of ethics includes 4 main tenets. The first is openness and dialogue, some demands concerning that, then honesty, issues concerning truth, reliability, trust, and such issues, and then respectfulness, including to all kinds of audiences and towards people working in other fields or industries. So, I mean, it's a rather concise code. We hope it's rather understandable. We've so far received really good feedback on the code, that it's been helpful. But please take a look. It's available online on ven.fi. That's VEN.fi. Well, I mean, I have to agree. I mean, on a general level, I've been here, working with this council. I've been giving some training in ethics, quite a bit of training in ethics, quite a few talks on the ethical issues in communications, especially here in Finland. And I think I have to agree with Teres completely. I mean, the problem is that ethical problems that are ethical are not always identified as ethical problems. And one background factor seems to be that ethics as a concept is identified with narrower set of issues like corporate social responsibility, reporting concerning that, this sort of supply chain issues like injustice somewhere, global concerns, and of course climate change. None of this is really a question of communication in particular. Well, perhaps CSR reporting is, but other than that, these are just basic ethical issues faced by companies and industries everywhere in the world. I might add a sort of a second problem with this sort of trying to identify the ethical in our practices is that, of course, we are not we are thinking of ethics as something sort of extraordinary. But there's going to be these extraordinary circumstances where the ethical issues arise, and quite the contrary. Of course, our ethical views are powering or keeping our practice going all the time. So it's almost sort of to be expected that the Nordic countries are a certain way here. We think we have ethical practice, like our ethical practices are quite sound. We live in these democratic societies where we have to do things in a relatively transparent way. So we've had to develop these practices that are also ethically sound. So we think we are doing nicely all the time, although of course all of this involves a whole lot of ethical reflection. So we're not always seeing that ethics is there in every kind of decision in the background. It's not only the extraordinary cases that are ethical concerns. Let me say a few words more about the recent conference, just couple of weeks back here in Helsinki. Here you can see a sort of a motivation for the conference. It was a conference bringing together people working in different fields of communication, so PR, communication, also journalism, to discuss current challenges for ethics and what to do about them. Please take a look at the website. It's helsinkiethics2020.com, and we hope that this series is going to continue eventually, at least within a couple of years. So there's going to be another conference, probably not in Helsinki, somewhere else, but I mean, this was supposed to start a sort of series of discussions, first identifying some issues and taking a look at potential solutions. Like, so as it happens, I mean, you can access all the conference material online. It's for at least for a fee, so you can actually see all the videos and take a look at the lectures if you so desire, just by following that link. It was a bit gloomy, I have to say, the conference. So many of the talks were really concerned, and they really gave us cause for concern. I am currently working on a conference manifesto or a statement based on the conference with an international panel from based on some of the participants and also some people who were not present there but who agreed to be involved on a sort of a committee to get a really brief document based on the conference, like bringing in the or trying to articulate what the main sort of conclusions or main new things, like novelties that came from the conference are. Of course, many of these issues are relatively familiar to all of us, but I think we are, we got a clearer picture of what these issues really might be during the conference. So, I mean, the problems identified, obviously, disinformation, eroding trust, also blurring boundaries between these types of communication or different professions of communication, political polarization, and then global issues, the whole concern of trying to figure out how to do things globally as we live in a global world in the sense of all kinds of industries and businesses and all this interdependence. So there's I've just written a few potential starting points for solutions. These are obviously not solutions by themselves, but starting points for solutions for these issues to be discussed in future events of the sort, which I hope you can participate in. So responsible sharing of information, more constructive communication, obviously transparency, and also the idea, and many people raised the idea of trying to develop a sort of a European and even global code. And the way I see it is that it would be nice for things to build from the sort of grassroots level up, rather than from, going from really, having these global organizations to set a code that might not be familiar to people like actually doing the work. We could have also, I mean, this is a good idea, but we could have also the opposite movement from grassroots up, which could be enabled by these different councils in different countries. For example, at this conference, the Austrian and German councils were represented. By bringing these different councils of ethics and these organizations together and try to devise at least on the European level. But that's of course a big project, and we'll see how it goes. I'm not going to take responsibility for the whole project. So that's the finished case. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you very much for that. It's interesting that when we were planning this lecture in spring this year, we were not aware of the ethics conference coming up, and it fits so nicely. So it seems to be kind of a really hot topic in this moment. I know that in preparing this talk, Jesper and I already talked about like mainly the question of whether there should be like European initiatives. We seem to be at a point where we don't even have to ask that question anymore. There's already like we're right in the action in this moment. Therese, do you want to react to everything Henrik just said? shortly. Or do you have a response?
Well, it's interesting to hear, and I agree on his perspectives on what is an ethical issue, and the complex way of looking at it, and that's probably why people don't necessarily feel they have lots of ethical challenges, but that doesn't mean they don't, and it's important that we help people facing the reality in a way. And regarding the a common initiative and more like common codes of ethics, globally, Europeanly, I see why it feels like there's a need. At the same time as I am uncertain, I must admit, in what kind of impact it will have from a practitioner's point of view. That for the research and for academics, probably it will help quite a lot to focus the studies. But if practitioners then will take these global European codes of ethics into their daily work, I'm not sure. Also because they might feel there are differences to the countries. Communicators might have different standings in the organizations from country to country as well. But it's a discussion I'm very keen on continuing, but I haven't concluded on what I think is if it's the right way to go.
Yeah, precisely. I agree. I mean, academics always tend to want to build these like big international, global, whatever systems, but obviously that's not going to work if it doesn't happen also on the grassroots level. As I said, so I mean, I think that's where we should start. Of course, it's a two-way street, sort of so we have to do something both on the European level if we want to develop this. But I mean, it would need to actually really involve these people who are working in different countries, rather than somebody coming up with a big, statement or a declaration or a code of ethics, and then people might post that on their webpage somewhere, but that's where it'll remain. It'll not come to fruition in any sort of practice unless people are really involved. But of course, these codes are tools, right? I mean, they are not perfect guidelines to whatever is ethical, so to speak. I mean, they are just ways for everyone who is a practitioner to reflect on what they are actually doing in everyday work. And so, I mean, that sort of help, I mean, even the European code might give that sort of, or have that sort of an impact, but it has to, be something that people are actually both not only familiar with, so we're talking often about how to familiarize people with these codes, but rather, I mean, that they are themselves involved in developing. And that's a huge challenge, and I'm not sure if we are actually really able to tackle that. But I mean, there's certainly a trend in this development, so we'll just have to wait and see, I guess.
Yeah, and I think to get us into the education. So from before they go into work life, future practitioners know that there are ethical dilemmas and are able to actually see what is an ethical dilemma and where should you go to find out how to solve it. That's one way to go along to get more. I know it's already in like BI and also at Christiania they do teach people or teach the students in communication in ethics, but that might be should be a bigger part of it, and also try to have these dilemmas. I think it's important, dilemmas that are quite open, that they can discuss from practitioners can discuss from their own point of view and from relate to their own organizations. So specific, but at the same time wide dilemmas with not an answer, because the answer would be different from organization to organization and case to case.
Yeah, very true. Jesper, do you want to give a short response?
Yeah, I can just give a very short response. Thank you very much, Therese and Henrik, for interesting talks. I've thought about this thing you said, Henrik, that the practice is rather sound, I think, in the Nordic countries. We might not have huge ethical problems in practice. I still think we have a problem there, because if you look at it from a an outside perspective, the level of trust when it comes to communication professionals in society is not very high, honestly. And there are a lot of cases of malpractice and bad communications behavior. So the one big question might actually be to how do you reach the actors or the organizations which don't relate at all to the ethical practice and the ethical IDs, because we do have bad examples also, and the bad examples are very often highlighted in media and so on, where communication practice is sometimes compared to pure propaganda and so on. So it's kind of it's also a matter of a professional reputation, this ethics discussion.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. I mean, to be a bit more specific, I think, you know, in the Nordic countries, we easily have this notion of not having that many ethical issues because we have, you know, live in this transparent, sort of democratic society. So we think we've sort of fixed it all. Whereas, of course, we haven't. There's going to be new problems all the time. How to reach those who are just, you know, almost intentionally, I mean, just oblivious to the ethical issues. Well, I'm guessing the only way, unless we go for more legislation, which is something that, of course, self-regulation pretty much tries to avoid. Unless we go for that, the only alternative really is immense peer pressure, like the whole industry scorning these bad apples, and I'm quite sure that that's going to have a good bit of an influence. And of course, you know, there's a limit to whatever these councils can do, and especially, for example, in the Finnish case, as we don't give any formal sort of reprimands, we can always, you know, we can never really tell if people are adjusting their practices according to these statements, or even the sort of like public debate notions that the council develops. But so far it seemed like, you know, all of the people who've you know, when the council has addressed this sort of problems, at least here in Finland, so, you know, we are, as we all Nordics are, we are highly respectful of authorities and laws and rules, and so we are. I think everyone who's been faced by the council, like saying, well, this is not exactly okay, have taken it very seriously for real, and not just pretended to do so. But of course, you know, yeah, problems there, self-regulations, traditional problems, of course, you know, I mean, how does it really function, and how do we bring everyone into the fold?
Yeah. Can I use this as a little bit of a bridge? Like, we have a lot more discussion like planned afterwards, but let me shortly discuss a little bit on like what research sees when we look at business ethics in communication as a research topic. Generally, a lot of those things that we have just discussed that are not so easily seen as by people in the field are covered in the research on communication ethics. So it's like practices like discussion of the organizational codes of conduct, addressing those breaches of code of conduct, considerate behavior towards all the stakeholders. And the research actually finds that those things really help. So rather than waiting till somebody else brings it up, if this is consistently brought to the forefront, people get more aware, it gets more on the agenda, but it needs to be put on the agenda. So in a way, it's interesting for us to be discussing on how ethics is a hot topic in this moment, because of course it is, for a number of reasons, but it has always been. There has been major frauds, major corporate crises, and those have always been there. It's a little bit the fact that we pay attention to it now makes it a little bit of a hot topic in itself as well. So if we look at the business ethics communication research, we see this on the one hand, this is what is covered. from the communication perspective. And we actually find that there is an outside push. There is this accountability that all businesses are confronted with the Sustainable Development Goals. In the previous lecture, there was also a discussion on how both customers and job searchers are actually actively looking for organizations that have those codes of conduct kind of in the forefront. So the job applicants are looking more and more for organizations that are responsible. They take a sense of pride in belonging to those organizations to some extent. And there's starting to be more and more kind of backlog and what we call greenwashing. So organizations that just have some of the essential keywords in their vision, but they don't really live up to those standards. So we can see the companies that are really confronted with this in social media. Those are often the companies that said they would do something and then fail to actually live up to those standards. So it's more central, but at the same time it's always been central. And what is interesting is that in a way, so ethical awareness depends on this role modeling, on people bringing it up in organizations, bringing up the discussion in the field and active discussion of those purposes. And if we think about that, there's a point in saying, so why are the people who do not see it, are those people bad people? Those people in the ECM monitor, the 40% that said, well, we don't see ethical issues, are they either already done, so are they at a higher level than the rest of us, or are they the ones that kind of ignore it? And there the notion of what we call bounded rationality comes really in handy to think about this. And bounded rationality is basically that our perception of a problem and the solution for that problem is kind of determined by our frame of mind. And if we say that simply, it's the same effect as if we're planning to buy a new car. All of a sudden we go out to the street and we see that car everywhere. That is not because somebody spies on us and yesterday's everybody got that exact car. The effect of that is because we become more aware of the issue, and for that reason we start seeing it in different places. And this works the same for ethics. So as soon as we have, we think about ethics, or even after this lecture, for the rest of this day, you'll probably see more ethical issues around you. We see this in the research as well, and we even do this as an experimental manipulation. So if we do studies on ethics, I do my research on ethics. I ask people to either think about the moral guidelines in their organization, maybe even write them down, or to strongly focus on performance. And interestingly, in those studies, we find that the people who are asked to think about performance, they get so set on getting the job done, doing it fast, meeting their targets, that sometimes ethics kind of move to the background and we don't see it anymore. And for that reason, it is very important to keep putting that on the agenda. Maybe have somebody there who is more or less the devil's advocate and kind of brings it up. So overcoming ethical blindness in that sense depends both on the social context, so that can really help. If the standards are in place, then people are reminded of that more often. Sometimes it also depends on personality characteristics. So some of us are just more aware of certain things all the time, right? Some people, in my cars example, just enjoy looking at cars. So we have natural tendencies, but to help us a little bit, organizations can kind of help there too. Could you switch? So summarizing a little bit what we have said, or kind of 5 tips of what you could do right now, and I will ask our panelists to react to that in a moment. But from the research, from the results we have been presenting to you, we would say, well, first, integrate ethics in the vision statement. So make sure that it's out there, that is actually your profile as an ethical organization. Check the level of ethics training in the organization, even if it's not completely popular. Like, we don't have all an attuned moral compass that fits details like the law, like Therese just mentioned, or that is aligned with what other companies do. And that might actually be important, because it's not only you and your organization, it's also the customers and the whole framework. Use communication to remind all the stakeholders of ethics. Make ethical practices visible, so ensure accountability. It's easy to say that you will do something, or that you set yourself a goal, but if this goal is not public, how can people know that you actually live up to the standards? So regular updates on the goals that were achieved are really good there, to see that you're actually following it up. And then finally, make an appeal to self-engagement. We know in our studies, for example, that if we are personally involved, and this has been said by our panelists, if it means something to us, to our own identity, we're much more likely to start to do it than the moment it starts to, that it is some kind of outside imposed rule for us. So if we self-engage, if we think, we make people think, like, how do I relate to this code of conduct? How does this company relate to this general code of conduct? It's much more likely to stick and to be actively practiced. All right, so thinking about that, we can go back and maybe we can, this is the agenda, so it says reaction and discussion. I will kind of start by inviting Teresa and then Henrik to react to this. For everybody who's online, please add questions to the Q&A, and we will mix them in as well. All right, Teresa, first response maybe.
Well, thank you. Well, on your last kind of tips or perspectives on how to integrate ethics, I think there's kind of two levels here. One is the ethical code of conduct for the organization itself, which I think these points make very much reason. And then you have the ethical principles for communicators, so ethical code of conduct for communicators, which should follow on top on that, and might be more difficult, as I see it, to make all these things regarding the ethical discussion internally in a kind of communication department. I want to go back to what I think are the discussions that should be more present internally in organizations. Is kind of like easy in a way questions, but still very difficult. And how far will you go in framing a case or a story? When does it become from targeting an audience to actually discriminating another audience? These kind of questions are the ethical, from a communication perspective as well, that we can discuss on everyday basic in kind of all the communication we do. And back to what Jesper said earlier on, that it's a part of the reputation, because it is not only a good reputation communicators have out there from bad reasons, but also sometimes, unfortunately, good reasons. And many of these is on from discussions on how that journalists feel that as you hide information, or it's difficult to get to talk to people you should, or they want to talk, like the directors and things like that, or that the situation is handled in a bad way and people might not trust that the information coming out from the organizations. So then again, it's like working on actually making a better transparency, telling when you don't know all the information, working internally to be kind of advocating transparency internally, and try to get transparency comrades inside the organization, work actively with the lawyers, with the managers, to make them see how transparent and more ethical communication can help achieving the goals. And yeah.
All right, thank you. Henrik, do you want to say something about that and respond to that?
Well, I was actually really interested, and this is related to what Teresa just said, in your point that making your ethical practices or your ethical ideas visible increases accountability, and I think that's quite important. I mean, it gives a bit of justification also for the self-regulation approach, that when the industry makes its ethical, ideas visible, then others can exert pressure, and there's more accountability from within and from the outside. You could say, I mean, well, you've done this, but look at your code. I mean, isn't this a problem? And so on. But of course, you could and should implement this as a, it's not exactly the transparency that Therese was talking about, but but close to that is sort of like making also internally in the organization and on a smaller scale, specific to the issues that your organization is actually facing, and the kind of work that you actually do, making it transparent. I mean, making this ethical side of these practices transparent. Like we have engage in this reflection, like in the open. And that also helps to introduce more accountability. So this is something we discussed. We have, this is something we've reflected on, and now we're not doing that. So, of course, that means that also within an organization, concerning specific questions, we can do this. And of course, that might be much more relevant than having a code somewhere, on a web page and a console and so on. So I think that's one of your points that I really want to latch onto.
All right, thank you. So there's a question on the Q&A that asks us, it's a long question. It says the person is curious about how to define issues as an ethical issue. How do we define an issue as an ethical issue or challenge? Are we differentiating between the different types of ethical issues, and is there should there be some kind of prioritization in how we see or how we prioritize those different issues? So it says, I've come across similar issues in my work. It would be interesting to hear your reflections, how to increase the awareness and also how to kind of prioritize different ethical issues. Well, it's a complex question. Teresa, do you have some idea of, or do you have any advice?
Well, I think that a lot of the work that communication professionals do daily could be framed in an ethical discussion. Some of the examples I already mentioned, like for instance, have you things like using data? What numbers and facts do you use in your communication? Does it show the whole picture, or do you try to frame a story? Is that story framed a bit too much to hide other stuff, or get the kind of not necessarily hide, but get the discussion over to something else? Is that ethical? In what extent do we frame it? In what extent do we use exclusive stories to media? Like for public organizations, they're actually not allowed to do that. That should be like at least in Norway, that information go out to everybody at the same time. So if you promise somebody a story first and somebody else asks for a report and it's actually public, then you have to give it to them. But for public, private companies, it's not like that. So they can actually choose, of course, where they think they get the best response. But is that always ethical? Do you try to broaden your audience, even though you don't get that much publicity, just to reach those groups you want to? How do you use the data? How good do you inform the data you gather to your users or the public? Yes, we have to follow GDPR, but to actually communicate what is in it and what do we use this data for, and how does that How could that impact the way the public and the users look at the way they share the data? That is an important ethical discussion as well, and how to communicate this out. And with all the algorithms and the black boxes that are made out there, there's ethics in that as well, where the communicators could play a big role. When we have the systems that the government basically can tell all the banks and everybody when somebody's dead to close the accounts because they know it. But what timing should it be? When do we know? When is it ethical to make these transitions of data regarding of who do we have to actually contact first and make the empathical and personal relation to before there is a message going out because of data collection. So there's lots of ethical questions, and you can just continue with all this. So I think it's more that to look at how far can we go in and why don't we go there? Then you already have an ethical discussion going on.
Okay. Yeah, very interesting. Thank you, Jesper. So you get ready for to give a response or to respond to this quickly.
Yeah, it's a short response time is running out here, I see. But I think Therese showed us that, I mean, we used to say that everything is communication, especially if you're a communication professional or a communication researcher. But obviously everything is also about ethics, which I think Therese showed us very well. I just think that I want to put into the discussion that I think that ethical discussions and the area of ethics should actually be one of the main topics for all communication professionals. In an ideal organizational world, the communication professional is an exceptionally critical actor in the organization, which actually takes this role, as you mentioned before, as the devil's advocate, and actually questions corporate or different organizational decisions from a communication ethical perspective in different ways. So I think that's really that the topic of ethics has been understated for several years, and I think it's good that it's raising in this professional area because it's needed. Yeah. Thanks.
All right, thank you. There's a few more questions, and we're also we'll balance the time. So there is a question on the use of AI in social media, like who should be responsible for building ethical considerations into those AI tools for social media. And I think related to that, there's another question on whether the public or the private sector should take the lead for ethics in practice. So let's maybe give a quick response to that. We have about a minute left. I think, yeah, Therese?
Well, to take the first in the AI and social media, I think there must be a collaboration with the computer engineers and the communicators. This is and probably lawyers as well. Like so many things these days, we have to collaborate across the organization and work together with others to make the best solutions. So I think this is a perfect example of one of those. But maybe it's for the communicators to then afterwards make sure that the ethical side of it is actually followed. But they can't code it, of course. And regarding the other one, I mean, for the public sector, you have more laws, so there's less. More is expected of you. So that might be a reason for why it thrives more transparency, for instance. But there shouldn't be any reason that the private companies should follow and also lead on this discussion. So I think it's a common responsibility.
All right, thank you. Okay, we need to wrap it up, I think, with an eye on the time. Yeah, I would like to warmly thank all our panelists today. Thank you so much for your input, for being here. Thank you for everybody who was online with us. Please remember that the next lecture will be on crisis communication. It will be on November 19th. And well, warm thanks to all our panelists today.